Thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you and your students today. Um, I know today is not the greatest day, um, just in our country's history, but I I think that I remain hopeful because of forums like this. There are still lots of people out there that want to continue learning about what they can do and gaining awareness. So I I'm inspired by that. Um, I looked at the list of speakers that you were having this semester, and I thought that perhaps I might be the one unique perspective that I might be able to bring is that of a university teacher, a music teacher. Um, and I'm actually trying something new in my studio this semester that I'm pretty excited about because it's working rather well. And it's something that came about to me over the summer when I was sort of thinking about what I can do differently, actually, as a teacher to make my teaching more inclusive. Because I think a lot of what I've done in the past and a lot of what people talk about in classical music is about the professional sphere. We're talking about having orchestras commission these pieces and hiring diverse soloists and diverse musicians, and all of that is incredibly important. But I think that in some ways, a root of the issue is that when we are in school, we're studying certain things, and then we get out into the world, and that's what we can do at a really high level. And so finding other things to do it can be really difficult. Um, so the another aspect of this is that I think that there are certain parameters that we think within. We think about repertoire and performers, but one thing that really I think has affected my career is the fact that I actually grew up playing many different styles of music and consuming many different styles of music. And I think that a lot of the values that I gained from those types of music, gospel, uh, R&B, Motown, those types of things, a lot of those things that I learned, I really, really apply each and every day as a classical musician. For example, the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, I remember transcribing her version of the Lord's Prayer off of one of my grandfather's records to play at his funeral. And in the act of doing that, I learned so much about rubato. I learned a lot about patience and pacing in terms of how to perform and really making the music feel like it just exists in time and space and that it's not necessarily all about playing the right thing on the page. It's all about communicating something. um, and when I went to university, when I went to conservatory, I I just sort of thought that it was starkly something different. I never really even realized that those skills or those values that I had gained for myself were actually helping me. um, and I think that it's something that um, makes me think about in terms of teaching. How can we instill values instead of just teaching certain material? Because I think that these values, if we find common ground in terms of values, then we're opening ourselves up to playing a much wider range of music. And so this goes beyond just playing BIPOC composers, it goes into playing music from other cultures in order to make ourselves better as overall musicians. And it's something that's actually been really, really working with my students, which has been very cool. I have a lot of students that are primarily classical performers, and then I have some students that are primarily jazz performers. And um, the folks that are studying classical music have been studying things like Etta James. And someone, we actually just had project presentations, and someone did a project from Queen. Um, all different types of things. Some people wrote their own music. So I've given you a very lengthy introduction to the idea. And what I just call it natural music making. That's the name that I gave this project. And I basically, I'm not sure if it's completely done, but the idea is that I've come up with 5 things that I think go into being able to be a high level musician. Um, in really any type of music. And so the students then had to do projects that fell within one of these categories. So the 5 categories are um, expression, um, and within expression is like, well, let me introduce expression and communication together. Expression is one, communication to me is sort of the flip side of that coin. So I think that when we perform music, especially in the classical music idiom, sometimes we don't actually even think about expression first. We're worried about, okay, I see all these rhythms on the page, I see all these markings, let me just do the markings and that should be what I want to do. But I think at the core of all of music, we're trying to express something, to our audience or to whoever's listening. The flip side of that coin is communication, I think, because whatever it is that we're trying to express is not inherently communicated to the person that's listening to us play, or because everyone brings their own experiences and all of that. So in many ways, as musicians, we are we have to think of ourselves as masters of perception. I think so. Um, Things that go into expression are things that are building our expressive palette. So one of my students did a project in which they played an etude, but then they went an etude that they really liked, and they went through and found all of the musical elements um, that they could muster up within it to decide that would help them communicate these expressive things that they feel when they're listening to it. So things like the harmonic structure, the use of appoggiaturas, the use of all these different musical elements that were put forth. On the flip side, there is someone else that also did expression that ended up writing a piece about about a poem that that their grandmother introduced to them. And so this piece was not only an expression of the poem, but it was also an expression of the feeling that they had in connection with their grandmother, and sort of thinking about how to take those elements and express them musically. And then for communication, this is more about thinking about how someone actually perceives what it is that we're doing. So expression and communication are the first two. Then the next one is listening or imitation in some way. So um, the first thing that comes to mind when I think about that is jazz musicians. Many times they transcribe recordings of greats and then incorporate those things into their own playing. But they're in music that is taught by rote or taught by listening. Many times there's nothing written down at all. And that is an incredibly valuable skill for us to all have as musicians. So for all of you, that doesn't necessarily have to mean that you do a jazz transcription. That can also mean something like if you have a favorite singer, if you like, uh, I don't know, if you like Lady Gaga, and um, you really love the way that she sounds on something, you could say, well, I'm going to transcribe her vibrato. I want to figure out exactly what does it sound like? What does it feel like to create the vibrato that she's doing? So you go in and you're um, really analyzing every single wave of the vibrato that Lady Gaga is doing, um, that, or on the other side, it could be something if you're listening to Arabic music and you want to understand how. Um, why it sounds the way that it does. There are lots of bends, lots of quarter tones in that type of music, and maybe you've never even done anything like that. And that music is certainly not usually written down, so you're learning this by ear. Um, so third being listening or imitation. The fourth is creativity, um, which in that category we sort of have composition and improvisation, um, ways to basically make something from nothing. And I think that when we think back to people like Bach, um, he is someone that, yes, we know for his compositions, but he's someone that engaged in all of these different categories. And I think it's not until much later in history that people started sort of siloing themselves in terms of like, I'm a performer, I'm a composer, I'm this, I'm that. But one thing for myself that has been really important to me is the idea of composition, because through composition, I've learned to have empathy for composers and to say, um, it really has humanized who the composer is to me. Like when I take the time myself to write molto espressivo on a page, I don't do that by accident. Like I'm not saying you might consider playing very expressively here. I'm saying like, please, this is my musical output. Like this is my humanity that I'm trying to communicate to you. Please do it. And so then if I am playing a piece and I see something in another language that I don't know, that's a directive. I feel this is maybe the wrong way to say it, but I feel much worse if I don't translate it, because that composer took the time to actually put that expression marking there, to put that tenuto there, to write the slur the way that they did, to put the phrase marking, to put the double bar instead of just a single bar. Um, all of those types of things. So I think it does that. It gives us empathy for composers, but it also allows us to have to take creative ideas and figure out how to put them in the framework of of musical notation that is so limiting. So most of us don't wake up in the morning dreaming about 4/4 or dreaming about, some 6/8 thing. We wake up in the morning thinking about ideas and conceptions and um, uh, things that we want to communicate, and so much about notation is limiting in that. So I think that um, it's something that can really make us feel a little bit humbled by the fact that, okay, now I sit down and have to write this. Okay, this doesn't look anything like the grand idea that I actually have in my head. So as performers, we have to bring that to the fore. Um, and then the fifth category is sort of mundane, and it's just fundamentals. Like we have to actually be able to play. We have to be able to produce a tone. We have to be able to change our tone. We have to be able to um, have good technique. Not good technique in terms of like it has to be within the Western idea of what good technique is, but we have to be able to actually just play stuff. um, and That's really important actually, because I think that a lot of musicians from other cultures, whether it be Black culture, um, um, Eastern European, a- different types of Asian cultures, um, there are lots of people that are amazing at their craft, amazing at their instrument, amazing with their voice. Um, but since that music sometimes is not considered to be highbrow or whatever, um, we somehow think that it's like easier, or that it's some sort of fringe thing. You know, I think in the saxophone world, one of the examples, and I hate that I'm even saying this, one of the examples is actually like Kenny G. So Kenny G is the bane of every saxophonist's existence, because in many ways he sort of, plays things that people just want to hear, and there's not always, we don't think that there's always a lot of depth, in the music that he puts out. um, but if I'm to think about most classical saxophonists and say, hey, I know that you're saying that you don't like Kenny G, but could you play like him? Like, could you actually play Songbird? um, could you do it, with that tone, with the same individuality that he plays with? Um, and I really don't think that a lot of saxophonists could do that, especially classical saxophonists, because we're so used to just like trying to keep one thing above all others. So we're trying to keep the round tone and the whatever, all of those types of things. But the fact is that a true virtuoso, can use their instrument to do anything. And so it's not only about technical virtuosity, but it's also about tonal virtuosity, musical virtuosity. And so one of the things that I think is, I know that I'm sort of long winded here, but I think that at the core of all of this is decentralizing classical music and classical ideals of what is good and what is not. And we're trying to develop the core aspects of musicianship and control over one's instrument, over one's craft, to be able to have a fighting chance to play something, that comes from, um, all of these different types of cultures. So if we're trying to emulate, um, a traditional Japanese instrument, we're not just saying, oh, well, I'm going to use all of my classical chops to try to sound like this instrument over here. It's like, no, I'm going to actually use my ears and try to make my instrument sound exactly like that, or really understand what the purpose of that, what does that instrument communicate, what does it, really say to the listener in the context that it was meant to be in. um, so this was this whole idea of natural music making is something that I came to because I just sort of realized that the entire system of music education is supremacist. It it makes us think about a certain types of things being better than other things, and so we teach music theory in a way that says every other type of music has to be viewed through this lens. And so what I'm hoping to do, to develop this into, is some way to think about learning music in a way that does not, um, have hierarchy, but that prioritizes the things that we all share as musicians. Um, and I think that's maybe the next step past repertoire and past hiring different, musicians of color and female musicians and things like that. It's sort of getting to the real core of everything. So when we think about someone that is music performance major. We don't immediately think, oh, classical musician. We can think music performance major. Oh, they should be able to perform music. Um, so that's my little spiel, that I thought might be interesting for you, because I know that a lot of people are sort of thinking about the performance side of things. So I've been reflecting on how these values might be reflected in sort of traditional music education.
So, so I'm going to lead right into some questions about the TEDx talk you gave at Northwestern. So, first question is from Tiffany. So, in context of what you described, um, uh, so it's been 3 years, or it's certain periods, more than 3 years, but it's been a certain period of time. Have you seen any changes made by music schools and conservatories to promote diversity? If so, how?
Yes, I've seen changes, and I think they're happening in different ways all around um, the country. But for example, at Northwestern, they literally adopted a lot of the things that I was talking about at that time. They just changing course handbooks in terms of, like, if you have your theory or all skills, what's the word I'm looking for? Course packet, where all of the information is in there of, like, okay, you're going to sight sing this melody, and then you're going to do that, just including different composers. Um, that happened almost immediately, actually. Um, and um, I think a lot of schools are now well intentioned with what they're doing. I think a lot of people now are trying to figure out what's next. Like, we understand that, okay, this isn't enough. So what do we do now? So now people are um, creating endowed scholarships for, you know, students of color, and they are trying to reevaluate the faculty that they hire, to bring in not only different people of different backgrounds, but people that will be able to bring different types of teaching to the fore. So, um, actually, at Manhattan School of Music, I think just recently they hired people that they're calling, like, artist citizens or something like that, and they're coming in, and I'm not exactly sure what they'll be doing, but perhaps they're not just going to be teaching lessons, but maybe they'll be doing some sort of historical um, teaching as well. Um, I also think that um, schools. So let me say this. So after I did that talk, I think some people were like, "Yeah, yeah, okay." Um, then after this past summer, I actually heard from a lot of people that were like, okay, I get what you were saying now, including, like, the dean at the Beanin School at Northwestern, because I mean, I tried to advocate to her several times, and she really was not very open to it. But I think now she understands the vitality, sort of the important nature of making these changes. Um, so yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different things happening. That's just scratching the surface of what's happening. But I'm encouraged by the things that people are doing. I just Now I think I'm starting to understand that the issues are even sometimes more fundamental than the ones that I was even talking about at that time. So
Yeah, one of the things that kind of stuck with me was from that talk from the TEDx talk is you talked about your conversation with Aaron Dworkin, that it's actually to um, initiate change is actually not hard, but actually the hard part is getting people to think about the change, right?
mhm.
To initiate that conversation, right? Because that initial step, when they coming from a position of privilege, if they don't even realize it's a problem, well, they're not even going to start that conversation or that train of thought. So getting people to come to that point of, okay, so what can we do to change? What can we? So I think once that uh, flip happens, then it's sort of downhill. But it's such a big uphill to get to that point where whether it be the dean or your applied faculty or the students themselves to say, what's the problem? So I think that flip of willingness to think about and consider this idea about racism and inequity in classical music. Um, I mean, I think I've at every level of education that I've been through, and still seeing my sixth grade son going through, whether it be a Suzuki cello book, which is all white male from. So it's just at every step of the way, and so. And one of the things that I want to point to from that talk is that when you started to look at what people are doing and you started your phase of research, because I think our students are now at that phase of, okay, I realize there's a problem. What can we do to take the next step? And many of the questions are asking those things. Uh, and so I would love for you to talk about two phases. Your research of looking for diverse repertoire, looking for initiatives, because you mentioned in the TEDx there were actually many initiatives like the Sphinx, like the database, but then it just seemed like a little bit there were many efforts without coordination. So and without coordination and without institutions, conservatories taking on and uh, pull, joining hands, because it's so frustrating to see Sphinx do all this great work, and then there are institutions that completely ignore their work. Um, so I wonder if you could lead our discussion and our students through your experience going through that research, and then what can, on two levels, what can our students learn from that research steps that you took, and then two, um, your advice to the next step forward after you have done, once you become aware of the initiatives, research, and by composers and performers, what's the next step?
Mhm.
Sorry, that's a very complicated question.
No, yeah, yeah. So just from my perspective, what I did, I mean, I just started listening to as much music as I possibly could. I mean, I'll literally never forget the first time I heard, like, I talked to Aaron Dorkin, and then he introduced me to Joseph Boulon. And I listened to Joseph Boulon's music, and I literally just like sat in my apartment and cried because it was like, holy crap, like, where has this been? And I looked at his picture and I was seeing this black man, with the wig and the sword, and like what is I was just like, what is happening? And so that experience just made me want to keep digging. Um so it really wasn't that um organized. I don't think. I think it was more so like, okay, who are some of the most prominent black composers? So like, on my wall right here, I've got staring at me, Joseph Boulon, Florence Price, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, George Walker, William Grant Still. And then with George Walker, like, I just started listening to a lot of his pieces, and his piano concertos, and like, he has a trombone concerto that's amazing, um in its own right, and not like amazing for X. It's like it's amazing music. And Samuel Coleridge Taylor has so much music. And I think maybe the thing that's harder about doing this research is that people haven't always sifted through the music to tell you what's the best of the best. So I remember, some of the pieces that I listened to from Joseph Boulon and were like, I don't particularly love this piece. Um, But then I also have to remember that 2/3 of his music has been lost. 2/3. Like, imagine if if Mozart, if like, oh, we lost Don Giovanni, like, oops. Like, or, um, and so I think about that, and I sort of have a little bit of empathy for that. And so the fact that I'm listening to it, I think, is sort of the research, because it's not just saying, oh, this music is there, because the fact of the matter is the hoity-toities at the top of classical music, they look down at this music. They look down at it because they don't know it.
Right.
If you listen to some Mozart stuff or some Brahms, like, or some whatever, like, these people were not just like infallible composers. Like, some of the music is not great. It doesn't
Hmm.
hit the mark. Um, and so it's going to be the same with any composer. Like, we all we all do things that we don't love. So then, like, um, in preparation for the TED Talk, for example, I probably listened to hours of Boulon's music to find the right clips to play,
Hmm.
to find the right thing that is something that I feel like is something that people will actually be able to latch onto and sort of
Hmm.
appreciate. Um, and that's a inherently odd process, because then I think about it now and I'm like, I was really sort of bringing these sort of supremacist attitudes to even the way that I was approaching that. But I was doing that because I know that in order to make change, you have to build trust with people that are very small minded.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was a big part of it, was literally just taking the time to carving out the time to sit down and listen to the music, and not just be like, wow, it's great that this is a Black composer. Um, so that was one aspect. Um, I think that additionally, um, part of the research was understanding why there is so much resistance to change.
Yeah.
And for me, what I've learned is that many people are not ill-meaning. They just don't. Um, they just don't have extra time. And if they've taught the same course, they've conducted the same pieces for 40 years, for 30 years, it's really genuinely hard for them to start over.
Hmm.
And I didn't have empathy for that when I was like doing the talk and after that. Um, but now I think I understand that, because I went to so many people saying like, let's do this. This makes so much sense. Like, let's make it happen. And then I realized those people, like, they teach their class. They have to grade the papers. They have a family. They have to do all these things. And so, Chris, like, the way that you're doing this, like, you're going above and beyond your actual duties, as an orchestra director, to have this series of conversations. So you have to, like, so I applaud that. But I think that with a lot of people, you have to understand that you're not only trying to convince them that it's right, but you're trying to convince them to move it up on their list of priorities. Like, am I going to, um, I don't know, go to my daughter's ballet recital, or am I going to spend this time researching a new batch of composers for my curriculum? Because many of them did that years ago before they got tenure and all of those different types of things. So I think that the reason I'm saying that is because I think that we all want change to happen really badly.
Hmm.
Um, but it can help in advocating to be able to speak the language of people that are resistant to it. Um, because you don't want to demonize people. You don't want to make everyone else feel like they are a horrible person just because they're not doing this. Um, so I guess those would be the sort of the two sides of it.
Yeah, but I would still argue that um, so if somebody witnesses a crime and doesn't say anything and is simply a bystander, well, I wasn't part to that crime, right? I think that for me that's sort of uh, a little more closer analogy, because once I got exposed to Florence Price's music, Lily Boulanger's music, John Balloon's music, I said, why didn't I, why wasn't I taught anything about these? And in
Hmm.
fact, when I did Lily Boulanger's Psalm 130 here at Cornell, one of the librarians who said came to me and said, "I'm really glad you're doing that piece because I remember a day when they said Lily Boulanger's music was trash."
Hmm.
And this, they were talking about faculty who are no longer teaching at Cornell, right? And I said, what? What? Because I was going through that phase of, holy cow,
Hmm.
Lily Boulanger was a really good composer. So in the midst of this sort of discovery, like I'm going through this phase of, oh my God, everybody should know who this person and this person's work. Um, so uh, as a younger musician, um, uh, I look back on my teachers and mentors who focused on the canon, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms. Sure, there were absolutely great lessons to be learned from that, but they insisted upon that very narrow path and saying things like to me when I was looking for a broad repertoire. And for me, early in my career, it was all about contemporary music and what I wanted to learn as wide an array of music as possible. And many mentors told me, so imagine the 100th time you're doing Iroquois Symphony, and the perspective and layers that will bring you on that 100th performance. So that was the value that was being instilled to me as a young musician by my mentors, right? So, uh, okay, so at that point in my development, yes, I needed that kind of refinement and ability to focus and learn about that set skill to become a better musician and so forth. But it was done at the cost of excluding exposure to a wide and broad array of composers and works.
Hmm.
Uh, so for me, it's more of an analogy of, um, sure, you're not a ill-meaning person when you don't pursue an uh, underrepresented composer's repertoire. But it's also, you're not entirely guilt-free in that transaction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think that the perspective that I'm coming from is from, eh, to be honest, like it's from just being hurt so many times with people saying no and me having to understand why, like what is the big deal? Like
Yeah.
why won't you do it?
Yeah.
And um in order for me to continue doing the work that I'm doing, it's like the only way that I can stay sane. Um, because I have to hope that people don't just think that the music is worse and that people don't think that if a black composer uses a spiritual as inspiration that it's somehow less than Dvorak using
Mhm.
music of his homeland or
Yeah.
um and so I totally agree with you. And I think this maybe goes into a deeper issue of like, I've always, even when I was doing the TED Talk, everyone might find this to be interesting. Like, the TED Talk was not supposed to be about music theory, oral skills. That was not what it was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about humanizing black men, and they told me that the things that I was going to be talking about sounded too much like complaining. Ted, like, and so it's whitewashed. it's whitewashed into something that, oh, okay, well, here are some, things that I can take. But the real thing about all of this is like saying that these people's intellectual property, intellectual output is as valuable as what's already there, and that the fact that we have forgotten about it and left it aside and excluded it is wrong.
Hmm.
And I think that I actually know that Aaron Dworkin has similar feelings and similar understandings, that like, as Black men ourselves, if we are always um if we always speak in the most true way, people will not listen anymore. I've been on calls with Aaron where he said, "So how real do you want me to be?"
Yeah.
And that's a reality um of this. I mean, so when I auditioned for Young Concert Artist, I didn't play any underrepresented composers except for myself. I played my own piece. Um, and that's because I knew that in order to get in, I needed to play things that they knew. I needed to do that. And now that I'm there,
Hmm.
my debut recital will have 3 commissions on it. And I'm commissioning like 5 pieces right now, and all of them by BIPOC composers. And so sometimes I think I've had to pick my battles of when am I going to do this, and when am I going to sort of put my head down for a second to get to this next step so that I can do more. Um, so all that to say, all of anyone that's not from these backgrounds, it really does help when you speak up. It really helps when you say the thing in the way that we can't. Um, within reason, of course.
Right.
But
But it's
but
that idea of
yeah,
intersectionality, right? If you're in a
right,
classroom full of males and there's one woman, right, then males need to speak up for her, right?
right,
So it's you have to empower those who are not able to, and that's part of being a decent human being.
right.
You reach out to um, those who need help. If you have the power to help, that so you can use privilege to enable those who don't have the power to speak up. Um,
Right.
so just kind of focusing on the repertoire. One of the things that you talked about that I really want to have the students think about is uh, I would often get comments that, oh well, history would have sifted, has a way of sifting quality works. So if I don't know about it, then it cannot possibly be good because I'm a world class musician. So if I don't know about it, then how can it possibly be a good piece, right? But with Joseph Blon's music, with Florence Price's, I'm in the process of reading her excellent biography, it's a tragic story of this woman who's trying to. So she's giving away manuscript to conductors and musicians, just like handing things out, and then of course those people who have this manuscript are just like throwing it off. So we have lost so many of our works, just as we have lost 2/3 of Joseph Blon's music. So and in contrast, we have all the big ones: Mozart, Brahms, Beethoven. We have years of scholars sifting through their works, even the mediocre ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a way, yeah, history has sifted the entire catalog of Bach and Beethoven, right? So you're only given the very very best, right? And then to all of a sudden say, well, here's a piece by Joseph Ballon, and then, oh, well, that's not that good. But hey, wait a minute. You have to do the same amount of research to find the quality works, because they're human beings. It isn't. They're not going to be a superhuman being. In fact, they are, because through all the oppression and racism, they fought through and was able to compose works for orchestras and so
Hmm.
I think that excuse of somebody who says, "Well, if history sifts good music," I think that really has to be taken apart because there has been systematic way of um, devaluing composition by a woman composer, by a BIPOC composer. Um, the orchestra in Paris, whom Joseph Boulogne was hired, refused to play for him.
Hmm.
And if it wasn't for Nadia Boulanger, the older sister of Lily, advocating her entire life, teaching all those American composers about Lily Boulanger's music, we wouldn't have that. Her music would not have survived. She was lucky to have an advocate who fought for her. Um, so, um, so we have to fight for um, music by underrepresented composers in a similar fashion through scholarship,
Right.
through research.
Yeah, I think that's also like just an excuse, sort of, because as performers, we have to like try harder. You know, if it's a piece that we don't know, I actually this is where it sort of intersects with me being a saxophonist, um, because um, a lot of people don't know the saxophone repertoire, and so if I go and perform a piece with a pianist, like they're not going to be bringing the same amount of expertise to the piano part as they are like if I just played the Franck sonata, because then they would have probably studied in their lessons, and they'd know all the key relationships, and
Right.
they'd know all the
Had a coaching from
um,
their own teacher.
right,
Right.
right. But then if you just sit down and read, the Samuel Coleridge Taylor clarinet quintet,
Right.
then you're probably like, oh, that note sounds weird. But then, if someone else had wrote it, you'd be like, oh, well, that's, fate, coming back, for whatever.
Yeah.
And so we view it like that. So as performers, I think we have to do the research as well. Like we have to practice it with the same mindset of like, this is amazing. Like this is a masterwork.
Hmm.
Let me find out why.
Yeah.
And that can help bring these works to the fore. And that's also why it's important that the top tier, orchestras and performers are finally starting to get woke about these things. Because like if, you know, I play with the Cleveland Orchestra every now and then. It's like if the Cleveland Orchestra would play some of these pieces, like, oh my gosh, like if they would record some of these pieces, then that's how things have gotten past. That's literally how the Cleveland Orchestra got famous, because they recorded a bunch of stuff with Zell. Um,
Yeah.
so
I
anyway,
found I was doing research on women composers, and I found an overture by Louis Farrenc, who was the first dean of the Paris Conservatory. And in a similar way, once she became the dean of the Paris Conservatory, all of her male colleagues tried to destroy her career. And so they were systematically destroying her music and all this, like, and putting on bad performances of her compositions. And so I found this YouTube video of a orchestra playing one of her overtures, and it was such a horrific performance that I thought, oh, that's not such a good piece. And then I
right.
found another recording by a much better orchestra. I was like, oh, that was a good piece. So,
Exactly. Yep.
yeah. Okay, so I'm going to jump to some of our questions about, and Casey just asked about allyship and advocating for diversity in the performing arts. Zach writes, what efforts can the rest of us students undertake to contribute towards the same goal, supporting our BIPOC peers and increasing diversity and inclusion in orchestra? We had like 4 or 5 questions in a similar vein.
Mm-hmm. Um, sort of going off of what we were just talking about, I think that some of it is like if you are performing a piece um, by an underrepresented composer, making sure that you don't that you bring your best to it for sure. Like making sure that you don't forget to make all of your markings in your part and all the things that you know that you should do, but that when sometimes when you go to orchestra, you're like, oh well, maybe I won't do it, because your performance of that could do exactly what we were just talking about. It could change someone's mind
Hmm.
about the music.
Yes.
So representing the music well. Um, I think also in terms of support, um, this has to be sort of done within reason. But I think for your friends, for your colleagues that come from underrepresented communities, we have to sometimes understand that um, just know that they don't feel at home sometimes where they are. Um, and, not berate them or anything, but just really sort of think about the fact that they are often uncomfortable, like more often than not, uncomfortable in the classroom, in the orchestra. Like when I was at Northwestern, the symphonic wind ensemble, there's a picture. I think I put a picture in
Yeah,
the
you're
TED
right.
talk where
Yeah.
it's like I'm the only brown spot.
There's me in the third row.
Yeah, yeah, and that literally made me nervous. I mean, just because like I was principal saxophone and I just inherently just felt like I like shouldn't be. And so when the conductor came down on me, I felt like it was me and everyone else like me. Um, and so like if something like that happens, like and you thought that they sounded great, just tell them that. You know, don't just keep it to yourself. If you might feel that way. All the way down to things like um the the way that we like I don't know. Things that we take for granted that like everyone knows. Um, it's not always the same. And I don't think this necessarily is just for um, BIPOC composers, but maybe for even international students and um, whatnot. But I remember this is just sort of a funny anecdote where like when I got to Indiana, like I was at some party or something and like is it called Don't Stop Believing? Is that by Journey or I don't remember. Yeah,
I used to be a
that
Journey
song.
fan, so I should know this.
Yeah, that song came on, and it's like everyone like went crazy. It's like yeah, yeah. And I was like, what is this song? I've never heard this in my entire life. Why is everyone like freaking out? But for me, if like um, PYT by Michael Jackson or something came on, like, I'd be freaking out and maybe they'd be like, oh, I don't know that one. Um, and so those types of situations, like when they happen like all the time, contribute to someone just not feeling welcome.
Welcome.
And so like, and maybe it's just including them like what are some things that you like, what are some things that we can do to um that would that you would like to do, can be really helpful just as friends.
Yeah, and at Cornell, there used to be a at the Statler restaurant. There used to be a faculty soup hour where they had soup. You could get soup. You could buy like tickets in advance, and it's like you get soup for $2, and you sit down and have conversation with faculty. Yeah, I used to
Hmm.
go, but I would be the only non-white person there, and I felt so uncomfortable. And I would just sort of sit in the corner, have soup by myself. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to go have soup in my office by myself rather than
Yeah.
feel awkward. And so not once, and I went over like I had 10 tickets, so I had to use them up. Okay, so because you buy them in advance, I went 10 times. Not once did any of the faculty come over and say, "Hey, I'm from this department. Hello." Not once,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
So they just figured, and I guess I looked younger at that point, so they just figured I was a student sneaking into the faculty soup lounge. But that sense of it's very easy for us to be in spaces where you have your own cliques and you have, you know, your
Mhm.
friends. I mean, often I spend the month of September and October eating in North Campus with my freshman orchestra members because they don't know who to eat dinner with, right? And so after about a month, they found their friends, and it's like, we don't need you, Chris, anymore. So, but that sense of trying to welcome people into your spaces goes a really long way. And I know some of my most endearing students are the ones that I used to have, you know, those freshman dinners with in September, right? Because
Mhm.
they literally didn't know, okay, I have to eat dinner, and then yeah, I got to figure out, oh, thank God, Chris is over there. So, um,
Yeah,
so that gesture goes a long way in welcoming um, people.
definitely.
Yeah. Uh, let's see. Okay, I'm gonna jump to another question. Um, so uh, our students really enjoy your TED Talk as well as the Arts Engine interview with Aaron Dworkin. Um, and they loved your performance. So Danielle Levanti asks, in your interview with Aaron Dworkin, you mentioned how you were blown away because you've never heard the saxophone sound so subtle and sincere. This is apparent in one of your pieces on the baritone sax with the piano duet. The saxophone almost sounds like a cello at certain points in the song, and I couldn't believe that I was listening to a classical saxophone piece. Typically, I think of saxophone associated with jazz and string music. Do you think your interpretation of saxophone music will expose others who are jazz musicians, enthusiasts, to more classical music?
Hmm. Well, thank you for the compliment. Um, I I don't know if it will inspire other jazz musicians to do this, but I think it opens up just an interesting point, um, because for me, like there's an entire classical saxophone community, like, and one of the interesting things is that like there the level of playing like is something that you guys wouldn't even believe. Like it's so good, such interesting music, new music, music going all the way back to um like the mid 18th mid 19th century, um and I think that it's just so much in its own bubble that it doesn't ever really get to the people. Um, and that's one of the things that has been so interesting for me since I got on the roster for Young Concert Artists, because I could play anything and no one will have ever heard it. Anything that's written for saxophone. And so, like, but to me, it's like, oh, this is like what everyone studies like in freshman year. So like I'm going around and playing the Glazunov saxophone concerto, and like I'm looking at the programs and they're saying a new voice emerges. And I'm like, Alexander Glazunov? Like or like what's happening here? Um so I think that um I actually think that it might inspire more classical musicians to listen to saxophone than jazz saxophonists to do more in the classical realm, because jazz musicians, um, honestly, throughout throughout history, like throughout the history of the saxophone, have, I mean, once it came to America and all that, have sort of looked down on classical saxophone, and really say, like, well, what are you doing with your life? Like, what's the point? Everyone wants to hear this. And um, so I think the saxophone is so young that we now have this opportunity to make it whatever we want it to be. But the jazz musicians like are already set, like in a way. I don't really convert many jazz musicians, um but I do convert a lot of classical musicians to being like, wow, I've never heard the saxophone sound like that. Like I'm also in a quartet, and in almost every single chamber music series we play on, we're the first saxophone quartet. And sometimes we play the most freshman in college pieces, just play them well, and they really connect with people just because it's the sound and the whole sensibility that is new to them.
I think um, uh, being a former oboist, I was always struck by certain instruments tend to be very conservative in their preference of repertoire that they play, like violin, cello, piano. You know,
Mhm.
you'll often find a contemporary music specialist in those instruments, right?
Right.
And then sort of your traditional instruments, which form the majority, and then saxophonist, bassist, uh, bass clarinetist, any weird instruments. Like basically, they're like staking out territory for their instruments, or they're
Right.
commissioning composers as a normal behavior, and so. Um, in a way, the sure, it's an instrument that is uh, more obscure, but I think uh, every saxophonist, every percussionist, every weird instrumentalist like I've met, they were all proponents of contemporary music, and their repertoire was much more wide and varied and progressive and all of that. Yeah.
Right.
Just a short story. I know I'm talking too much, everybody, but first time I heard Carl Husa's String Quartet Number 3, transcribed by Fred Hemke, and had at Northwestern this student saxophone group play it. It just completely blew my mind that I didn't realize that was possible. It
Mm.
was such an amazing realization that it doesn't you don't have to play violin to be a virtuoso.
Mm.
Um, so yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump to another question. Um, okay, so here's a question from Rebecca. It's living in Ithaca versus big city. Do you notice any differences between the mindsets of musicians in small town like Ithaca or versus larger cities?
Hmm. That's a good question. Um, yes, yes, but I don't feel like I've been here long enough to really know what it's like here. Um, but I will say that it's it seems like people are nicer. Like musicians are less out to get each other because there are like there aren't that many gigs to begin with, so people are just sort of like trying to find cool ways to make music together. Um, so like I'm coming from Cleveland. Well, I was there 2 years ago, and like because I played with the Cleveland Orchestra, like I almost like felt bad when I was around other saxophonists because I was new to the city,
Mhm.
and other people have been wanting to do that for years. Or if I like, and so there were like vibes, sometimes. But here there are no other classical saxophonists really. Um, so it's I don't feel that at all. Um, but and also I would say like here I have more opportunities to just collaborate casually with people. Um, uh, I play a lot with Zach Bjerken,
Yep.
your piano professor, and sometimes we literally just get together to read music or and like I'm writing a piece right now for tenor saxophone and piano, and I send him a draft and we just meet up and we read it.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff didn't really happen for me in Cleveland. So yeah, just some small differences.
Yeah, I found that to be the case as well. Before Ithaca, I was in Boston, and in Boston, if you start going to new music concerts, it's the same 40 people who show up for those concerts.
Yep.
And so, on one hand, that community is very tight knit and all of that, but the competitive nature in the freelance scene was such that, like, yeah, if somebody is sick with the flu, and a personal manager calls for you to come, you have to go with 103 fever, because if you don't answer, you're not going to get the second call, that kind of
Mm,
thing. So there was
mm.
always this sense of, especially other conductors in Boston. Like I showed up and I started going to new music concerts, and then they were like, "Who are you?" Right? And so, whereas Ithaca, I felt so welcomed by everybody, both Ithaca College professors and all that. Right? Okay, we're coming to. I think we have maybe time for two questions. Okay, so this one is from Elora. How do you think that the music industry, in particular orchestras and classical music, will move forward after the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial injustices that are being protested around the country? Do you believe there may be a lot of pushback against positive change? And if so, what can we as individuals do to make sure the necessary changes are made?
Mm. I actually think that um, people are making are going to make the changes that they should now. For example, um, I'm brand new to the Young Concert Artists roster, and they are now doing a strategic plan. They're creating a new strategic plan, and they literally asked me to be on the strategic planning committee
Great.
for Young Concert Artists,
Yeah.
and I am the only person like under 60 probably,
Wow.
and also the only person of color on the committee,
Yeah.
and that's an organization that would have never even thought about that
Yeah.
before, I don't
Yeah.
think. And you know, like with the Learning to Listen talk where Sanford Allen was there,
Hmm.
um, I think the New York Philharmonic really actually listened to that and felt humbled that Sanford was saying, like, yes, I was there in 1967 and Anthony McGill feels the exact same way now.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and so I think that people are making these statements, and that our job and your job is to actually make sure that they follow through with them.
Yeah.
And when we, I think actually Daniel Romaine is a really good example of someone that really holds people accountable for
Yeah.
things, and
Absolutely.
and just tells it like it is, and
Yeah.
then they over time like actually listen to what he's saying.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that um, to understand sort of the underbelly of classical music at the professional level is to understand what actually makes the change. And so I think these types of things, whether we see them right now, um, are are happening. You know, this strategic plan for YCA is going to be their direction for the next 5 to 10 years.
Hmm.
And we're having conversations about changing the auditions to have different types of requirements
Yeah.
and all these different types of things. So I think I think it's going to happen, um, and we just have to hold people accountable.
Yeah, both Carlos Simon and Jesse Montgomery, especially with the New York Times article, and they. So Carlos described. So he kind of felt like we're in this weird nexus, like we've been dropped off by a time machine where people are thinking about this problem when it's not like this hasn't been a problem in the
Mhm.
past, but all of a sudden people are paying attention to this problem of racism in classical music, and so he's really glad that the conversations are taking place. And then Jesse Montgomery also in the New York Times article cautioned about whether this is going to be a lip service sort of moment where they play one of her pieces and that sort of gives the organization, well, see, we do program Black composers, but then there isn't a significant engagement, there isn't a residency, there isn't a prolonged conversation, so that the way in which organizations engage with the composers, with performers, and the community to bring them together. I think she cautions that we don't give organizations a pass just for programming a 10-minute piece by a Black composer, and then
Right.
still don't escape that one digit um, um, uh, statistics, right?
Right.
I loved you when you said it would be one digit or two digits if it's a decimal point. I thought that was a great dig. um, okay, we're pretty much out of time. Some of our students have to go to their next course at 6:10. One of the things I love to do is take a group photo with everybody. So everybody put your screens on, and I'll take a group photo with everybody. All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3. We will remain on call until 6:25 for anybody who wants to stay a little bit longer and ask questions to Stephen. But Stephen, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your insight and wisdom. We really am so glad you are here in Ithaca, and we look forward to many collaborations with you in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a good time. We're heading off.
Casey, Taryn, do you guys have a question? Hi, Sal.
Yeah, I have a question actually. Sorry, I kind of just wanted to stay a little bit after, but so I was looking at some early exit polling from last